We have a great panel today, a real diversity of experiences. So with Clete, we have someone who's been recently in the U.S. government. Wendy, one of our premier trade negotiators over the last several decades, and now heads the Asia Society. Clete's a partner at Akin Gump. Tong, who's now at the Asia Group as a partner, just recently left the U.S. government from the State Department. So he brings the wealth of foreign policy and economic experience. And then Ann Lee, who's an author and has done a lot of work as a professor at various educational institutions, including in China. So really brings a level of understanding about the Chinese perspective. So what we want to do today is we're going to try to draw on these kind of different perspectives. Really going to kind of put a bit of a focus on the look ahead. So over the next couple years, a lot of ink has been spilled on the deal. We don't really need to dissect that one any further, but really look at how these different elements that are contributing to where trade is going and how trade is really affecting all these things. Because I think one of the real changes, certainly over the last couple of years, is how trade not only is a function of broader economic, foreign policy developments, but in turn how trade is affecting those. So we're going to do that. I'd like to start off. We're not going to really focus on the coronavirus, although that's obviously a big piece of it. And all the talented folks up here, none of us are an epidemiologist. But obviously that is something that really President Xi Jinping, I think, came out this morning in the press saying that this is a real test of the Chinese system. So obviously that's going to sort of affect all of this, and we'll try and speak to that. But that's a big uncertainty where we go forward. What I'd like to do, though, Kurt, let's start off with you. Maybe you can kind of give us a bigger picture, particularly some of the non-economic elements that you see sort of driving the U.S.-China relationship over the next couple years.
Thanks, Doug, and good morning, everybody. This being the first time this morning that China is being specifically mentioned, I just want to, on behalf of myself and I hope my panelists, express sympathy and concern for the people of China, people of Wuhan, because of the coronavirus. And I hope that this community, the trade policy community in Washington, will take an approach to this situation that is not triumphalist or finger-pointing, but rather one that expresses concern and support for China, because it is a shared challenge for the global community. Let me mention the four horsemen of the apocalypse, being the geopolitical guy for Asia and on this panel, and then two other things. The four are South and East China Seas, Hong Kong, Taiwan, North Korea. You gave us a 2-year time frame, Doug. In that time frame, those are not likely to be major factors in the conversation on U.S.-China trade policy, tech policy, and the running battle between the United States and China on those issues. In the East and South China Sea area, I would expect China to let sleeping dogs lie. They're not in a position or a mood to unnecessarily antagonize the nations of Southeast Asia or Japan. In fact, you have Xi Jinping going to Japan, or maybe going to Japan in April, and that I think will be at a slow boil. All of these four of these are in the longer term, beyond this time frame, very dangerous issue sets. But I think that's the way that one plays out. In Hong Kong, I would expect there to be a flare-up of tension and protest activity in the summer. If probably by then, the coronavirus will have subsided. There's an election in September. There's likely to be a lot of tension. Neither side has budged, and it's a stalemate situation. So I would expect that to become bad again, but not sufficient to affect the overall U.S.-China relationship to any great degree. Again, on Taiwan, they recently had an election reaffirming President Tsai's leadership and the strength of Taiwan democracy. That puts China on its back heels. I expect that China will double down in its military investments, but not choose the next couple of years for any strong diplomatic offenses. If I'm wrong, don't sue me. Don't make any stock exchange bets on this. But that's my analysis. And then on North Korea, Kim Jong-un has President Trump exactly where he wants him, and I would expect that he's more cautious and more methodical than his daddy, and I would expect that also not to rise to beyond a slow boil. But the two that I think bear further examination, external non-political or non-economic factors, the coronavirus, I think, will have an impact on China's ability to engage in negotiations with the United States in 2020. I would expect China not to meet its commitments on purchases. It might not have been able to anyways. But certainly if the U.S. comes back to China at the end of the year saying, hey, why didn't you buy X billion dollars of X, Y, and Z, China will say, well, we were dealing with something else. And I expect that to happen, and that's just kind of the way it's going to go. And phase 2 negotiations in 2020, meaningful negotiations, were unlikely anyways. And I'm sure other panelists will touch on this, but I think the coronavirus adds to that unlikelihood. And so the big wild card in all of this then is our presidential election in the United States. And obviously there's going to be some differences between a second Trump administration, which I would expect would then re-engage rather slowly in 2021 with the Chinese government, perhaps not very successfully, but there will continue to be very much a conversation driven by technology policy and a sort of the continued confused mix between technological containment and goods mercantilism. If another person is elected president, I would expect that person to double down on the technology issues as currently defined, but also digital governance and the more political aspects of technology issues, which again would lead to perhaps a change in agenda, less emphasis on goods and numbers, more on rules and technology, but certainly still an awful lot of friction, just perhaps of a different sort.
You sort of highlighted two things I think bear a little bit, the role of technology, right? So we sort of had this trade war, and we focused a lot on tariffs and the role that that's played. But in parallel, we've seen all these developments on the technology side. So whether it's limitations on purchases from each other's companies, export controls. I'm curious, kind of throw this out to the group as a whole, but particularly when we look at it from that standpoint, do we think that we can sort of successfully separate sort of these geopolitical developments from sort of trade and technology policy, or will they continue to be really intertwined over the coming years?
Well, I want to hear from everybody, but my sense is that the technology issues themselves will drive into the geopolitical context rather than the reverse being true. So for example, take the Xinjiang issue set. The technology, I don't think that what's happening in Xinjiang will be sufficient to be translated into a U.S.-China negotiation per se, but certainly it will add fuel to the discussion about what is the right approach to artificial intelligence and other control type technologies. And then, but that agenda, when it actually hits the ground in a bilateral negotiating context, will be a commercial agenda rather than a human rights one.
Yeah. Anne, sounded like you wanted to chime in on this.
Yeah, I really don't think that it's separable, because technology is so diffused. It's in everything now. And with Huawei rolling out its 5G, that's going to make it even more ubiquitous, because that's going to be the internet of everything, which would include self-driving cars, internet-operated appliances. And then with AI, clearly China is putting a lot of it to use. And so it's going to be in just about every product we are going to touch. And already the US is saying that China can't buy certain internet companies because of the data, and that could be a national security issue. Mm-hmm. And that pretty much has no limits, because they wanted to stop China from buying a dating app.
Right.
And so it seems like national security encompasses everything at this point.
Yeah.
So I don't know how you can successfully delineate technology from just regular trade in any goods. And so I think what needs to happen really is some sort of international forum, some sort of international institution to come up with the rules of the road, because this is going to affect everybody. And you want to have some consistency given that products are made across borders. So, for example,
Actually, Anne, let me interrupt you because I want to come back to that point in terms of sort of where we go with this.
Okay.
But you've kind of mentioned a really key issue, which is national security. And I think that's sort of a lead-in to our second topic, which is really how does the administration, we've obviously had this agreement. We have a kind of a dynamic ecosystem with the virus that's been mentioned. Clete, maybe you could sort of elaborate on, kind of where you see, sort of the administration going over the next year, given sort of your, and then maybe we sort of opened up this issue about technology and national security, which I think we all know has been a really important element to that. So maybe if you could kind of share your thoughts.
Sure, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. I want to say what I'm thinking about what happens in the next year or next 2 years. I do think you need to disaggregate two separate buckets, so to speak. One is what is going on with the negotiations, what is going on with the tariffs, is it phase 1 or is it phase 2? And then the other bucket is really everything else, and what's going on with export controls, what's going on with investment. And I'm not saying that they're unrelated, because they clearly are, and technology, as you mentioned, was one of the motivating factors for the trade negotiations in the first place. But I think as it's evolved, and especially as it's going to play out in 2020, they're going to be on somewhat separate tracks. And what do I mean by that? First, in terms of the trade talks, I do think what you're going to see from the U.S. this year is a real focus on implementation. And I think everyone here knows one of the long-time concerns with China has been on the follow-through. And my view is that the U.S. did a really good job in this negotiation, in particular on IP and on agriculture, on the structural chapters. I can tell you, as someone who was a negotiator, we were not nearly that far along when I left the administration last spring. So the U.S. really moved those two forward, got good agreements, but they're only as good as they're implemented. And it's really going to be important that the U.S. focuses on that and gets that done. I think some of that's also out of a practical necessity. China long ago basically decided it was only going to do so much before the election. And China has basically done what it's willing to do until it knows what's going to happen moving forward. And I think from the U.S. side, there is an interest in calming the waters a little bit in an election year. I think that's clearly a motivating factor. And so I think you're going to see, I'm going to use the word relative here. Compared to 2019, you may see relative calm with respect to the trade talks, but then you move over to the other stuff. And you look at the export controls, you look at the implementation of CFIUS and what's going on with investment screening. And I think it's clear to everyone here probably, especially those who are Washington-based, that the entire conversation, the entire posture of this town vis-a-vis China has changed completely in the last 3 years. And I feel naive now thinking back to when I was in the White House and we were talking about going down this path with China and thinking that, oh my gosh, there's not going to be any political support for taking this tough action. And now you see Democrats, Republicans, Congress, and the administration all competing with each other to see who can be tougher on China. And so I think you're going to see that play out again and again and again. And like I mentioned a couple areas, export controls, it's clear as it applies to Huawei, you're going to see this play out. I think you're going to see more legislation. Kurt was talking a little bit about some of the geopolitical things. I don't think they'll bleed into the trade talks themselves, but they could manifest themselves in legislation and things like that. So that's what I think is going to happen. Let me pivot for just 1 second on what I think should happen. And I'm no longer in the administration, so they don't have to listen to my advice. Sometimes they did and didn't when I was there anyway. But the real advice I would have is this. This is time for the administration to find a way to pivot from what has been a largely bilateral approach into something more joint with other countries around the world. And I will defend the administration for the reason they went down this path in the first place. The Director General was here before talking about the limitations of the WTO. It doesn't have rules to deal with forced technology transfer and all these problems, so it wasn't an option for the US to go to the WTO. And going to the WTO and thinking, oh, these negotiations are going to solve this in short order, we all know how that usually works out. And then you look at our trading partners, and there wasn't a lot of ambition. There weren't others who were willing to put in place 50 billion or all these tariffs to really change the conversation on China. So I think the US did what it had to do, but now that it has this phase one deal, I think it needs to move to multilateralize it as quickly as it can. And I think there are three major benefits from that. The first one is in terms of enforceability. If you look at the US right now, we have a really strong economy. And we're not always going to have an economy like this. We're not always going to have the luxury of being able to put in tariffs, large-scale tariffs in place for enforcement. And so I think that having other countries who can help us with that in a multilateral framework is useful. Number two, let's jumpstart the reform process. If China and the US come to the WTO and say, we both agreed on these rules on forced technology transfer, we both agreed on these rules on trade secrets, I think that could have a real incentive in getting other countries to the table. And then the third part is I just think at some level there is a limitation to the bilateral approach. And the more that this becomes a question of, is China capitulating to the US and doing what the US wants them to do, the less they're going to be willing to make changes. But if on the other hand, they see themselves as an international outlier, if we can work with other countries, EU, Japan, Australia, Brazil is someone I'd actually like to think there's an environment here where Brazil can be a contributor here. If we can work with those countries, I think that really gives a chance for some change. So, like I said, what I think is going to happen, what I think should happen, and we'll see how well my advice is heeded. I'm encouraged that there's more conversation about WTO reform. I'm encouraged by some of the things happening with the trilateral, but there's a long way to go. And the last point I'll make is I don't think this election changes it that much. And I think that there may be different tactics, but again, we have unleashed this energy on China. It's here to stay, and we need to figure out how to best deal with it.
Yeah, I think there would be a lot of agreement around that last point. But maybe let's unpack that kind of your multilateral point, because I think that was been a bone of contention from the get-go. So let's just I want to open this up to other views on the panel. But if we think we want to pursue that sort of multilateral approach, it's not happening in a vacuum. I mean, there's everything the administration has done vis-a-vis Europe, and we have kind of raising concerns there. I'm sort of curious what our other panelists take as we widen that aperture. Does the administration have that runway space to sort of open it up more broadly and play? Because I think you've put forward some interesting ideas. Wendy, you look like you have something to add.
Yeah, so perhaps I can start with this multilateral aspect, and I agree with many of the things Clete said, but I also have some differences as well.
It's okay, Wendy.
It's okay? Okay.
All right, now we're going to get a little spicy.
Okay.
Here, so okay.
So first, let's just, in terms of other countries, how they're responding to the phase one deal, I kind of see three types of responses. The first is basically a sigh of relief that the two largest economies in the world have kind of de-escalated, paused the tariff war, and seem to be on a path of, hopefully relatively quiet in the coming months on trade. Second, I think many countries are welcoming the structural rules in this agreement and the market access rules as long as they are applied on a most favored nation basis. In other words, they're hoping to get the benefits from this deal. They won't have the same recourse through the dispute resolution aspects of the deal, but many of the changes and improvements that China has agreed to will be applied on an MFN basis. But the area where there's, I think, going to be some friction and some difference in views among us and other countries will be the purchasing commitments. Now, these are massive numbers that have been agreed to, and it's hard to see how, even before the coronavirus, that they could be achieved, particularly without diverting trade from other countries. And so when Clete talks about working with Brazil, yeah, that sounds great for us, but if you're Brazil now, you're probably going to be looking at your contracts with Chinese purchasers for soybeans and see how that affects you. So I think while there will be a willingness from other countries to work with us, I think there will be a weariness as well going forward. That said, I don't think it was lost among anyone in this room that the same week we announced the Phase 1 deal, the EU, Japan, and the United States announced and put forward a joint statement, kind of this trilateral agreement, which makes concrete recommendations on what to do on structural issues, particularly the issue of industrial subsidies. And I think that in particular was kind of a piece of paper that didn't get enough attention in the trade community. And I would hope that the administration would really work lockstep with the EU and Japan, try and build out that group and try and agree to more rules around subsidies, because that's one of the key issues of friction between the United States and China.
Kurt.
I agree with much of what both Clete and Wendy have said, that it's important to pivot from a predominantly unilateral approach to one that is predominantly plurilateral. I'm not sure about multilateral in terms of using the WTO that much. I think WTO should be utilized, but it's certainly not going to be as the Director General was making very clear, it's not going to be the key mechanism for answering the China challenge. Where I do think that the election matters is not the level of energy that's being brought to the China challenge, because I see both Republicans and Democrats bringing a lot of energy to it. It's the degree of commitment to teamwork and global leadership that has not been exhibited by an accusatory politics, frankly, America first approach. I'm not sure you can do America first and lead the multilateral economic system in a positive direction that answers the China challenge at the same time.
Clete, you want to respond to that a little bit?
Well, I prefer to respond to one of Wendy's points. But
Well, you
I just
have
wanted,
the microphone, so
and
you
I
can
will.
choose.
I will. I'll get there. What I wanted to say first is just to clarify my point on Brazil a little bit, and I really was talking about the trilateral, and I think the trilateral with the EU and Japan, as Wendy mentioned, didn't get enough attention, but it does still have a ways to go. And I mean, what the EU and Japan and the U.S. basically agreed on were principles with respect to subsidies and industrial subsidies, but they weren't able to get to text, and I think they still need to increase their level of ambition so that they can get to text on subsidies and they can also get to text on SOEs. And I know countries like Australia have been very anxious to be a part of that. I think Australia can help raise the ambition level. I'd like to see them there. And that's where I thought bringing in Brazil would also be useful, because you could get some of the, I'll use quote unquote, because this is a bigger issue, developing country clout within that mechanism. And I think Brazil is looking forward to doing more with the U.S., and I know folks in the White House are looking forward to do more with Brazil. Mm-hmm. So I do think that there's a unique opportunity, and that's what I was talking about. In terms of the broader issue, I mean, look, certainly I was in the White House for 2 years, and while I did, really appreciate, I think, some of the energy that the president brought, forcing the question on these trade issues, certainly I think more diplomatic language could be used, and I do think that would be useful. So I mean, I generally agree with what Kurt said. I'm not going to disagree with that, but I think at the end of the day, we often make too much about what people say, and really it is about what are their own genuine economic interests. And I think that we're fooling ourselves to think that other countries around the world aren't doing what's best for them. And if Europe truly does perceive a threat from China, they're going to want to work with us on it. And again, I'm with you. I would change the rhetoric a little bit if I could, but there is still that motivating interest, and that's why we've still been able to make progress in these areas, even while tensions and talk is not going as well as it could.
So I want to pivot a little bit. So Anne, you've been sort of hearing, represents a little bit of sort of the U.S. perspective. I'm curious, I'd like to let's explore sort of how China's thinking about this. And the specific question I want to put to you, based on sort of what we've just hearing is if we accept, and again, I take the point that maybe China wouldn't accept this premise, but if we accept the premise that there are certain changes to the Chinese system that would make it a more open economy and fair competition, which of these sort of models that we've sort of been describing, sort of the way the administration's pursued it before, the potential for a plurilateral, multilateral, what do you think would be most effective with China that would sort of encourage managed evolution in their system most effectively?
Well, I think that what we were doing before, which is sort of engagement plus deterrence together, was most effective. I mean, I'd like to point out that China was already making changes to accommodate the US in regards to IP long before Trump instituted this trade war. China put together IP courts in China back in 2014, and in 2015, as Fareed Zakaria wrote, the foreign nationals that basically put IP cases to the Beijing court, all 63, 63 out of 63 all ruled in favor of these international corporations on IP infringement. And so none of the companies operating in China actually think that IP is an issue. And so it just seems like the Trump administration was making a big deal about nothing really on that front, at least. And as far as purchases of agriculture, all the farmers there seem to have said they were doing great business there until the tariffs came on board. And so I'm not so sure that the approach of trying to bully China really accomplished all that much in terms of changing Chinese behavior. In fact, I think it just made them more resistant to the US and more resentful perhaps in the long run. I think that definitely trying to work out solutions in existing multilateral institutions would probably be the best way, because China is trying to uphold the existing status quo, because they are saying that they want to support the UN, they want to support the WTO. Rulings that were against China out of the WTO, China quickly changed whatever behavior to accommodate the rulings of the WTO. So they were definitely responsive to an international community. And so in my humble opinion, having spoken to various Chinese government officials, I think that is the best approach, because that gives them the ability to save face in their parlance, meaning that they would not be shamed in front of an international community or singled out. They would feel like, okay, we're part of a community, and then this is fair, and this applies to everyone. And so I think if the U.S. returned to more of that approach, it would make more sense. And given that there are a lot of concerns about China's ambitions with technology and so forth, I think it really behooves the U.S. to sit down and have a real understanding in terms of what we're willing to give China in terms of its sphere of influence, because it is a very major power in the world economy now. I mean, they consist over 15% of world trade.
Yeah.
And so clearly they want to be at the table setting rules and not just simply taking rules as they did maybe 20 years ago, when they only represented 1% of the global economy.
So put our guys like Kurt, our diplomats back in business. Well, I have the advantage of watching some of the body language from some of your co-panelists. So I think there's a few comments that want to be made. Clete, I think I saw you gesturing first, and then it looks like Wendy wants to add a few comments as well.
So I agree with the point that there has been rising resentment or perhaps nationalism in China in recent months as a result of what's happened. There's no question about that. But I mean, I have to just disagree strongly with this notion that there were not problems in IP or in ag. I mean, I don't want to go through the mountains of evidence in the 301 report the things we heard from companies and still hear from companies about protecting trade secrets or intellectual property in China. I think the evidence is there. And on agriculture, I would just remind people, if you look at what was happening, and we were selling almost no beef, almost no poultry into China. They had a ban on our chicken since 2015. They had essentially a ban on our beef. Those are $2 billion markets. And so I think this notion that we weren't going to do any better on ag, I think, is also so misguided. But I want to turn to sort of your point, though, about resentment and nationalism. And I do think that there's somewhat of maybe a misunderstanding in China. And I think that sometimes we send mixed messages, and so maybe it's understandable. But I can tell you in conversations that we had in the administration and conversations we had with the president, this was never about keeping China's economy down. It was about market access, and it was about creating a level playing field. And I know that not everyone in our government sort of uses those words or those terms, but that is how the president views this. And I do think that it's important, if we're ever going to solve these problems, we figure out ways to communicate on that level. And so I just wanted to make that.
That's a good point. Wendy, you had...
So just on IP, and just to kind of reflect on my career, I negotiated a lot of agreements with a lot of different countries. And I'll tell you, the easiest negotiations, and they're all difficult, were with countries that wanted to reform for their own reasons, right? And so when I look at intellectual property, it's hard to even imagine today that some of the most difficult negotiations were with, let's just say, Japan and Korea 20 years ago in intellectual property protection. But once they recognized it was in their own interest, they became partners with us. And I think today some would argue that Japan's even gone beyond us in terms of what it's seeking internationally on intellectual property. And I think with China, it's kind of the same thing when it comes to IP. A lot of the improvements that have been made in recent years with respect to the IP laws, with respect to IP enforcement, is not because of US pressure, but it's because it was in China's own self-interest. And then, our interests coincided and we were able to work together. And I would hope that there would be other areas in the relationship as China wants to reform more and hopefully open up more. But frankly, we kind of are not seeing that now. If anything, I think we're seeing a trend towards more reliance on state-owned enterprises, more subsidies, a bigger role for the state in the economy. So that would just be a response to that. And just with respect to China in the WTO, I think there's a lot, potentially we could do together in the WTO. But frankly, there's some key issues we need to resolve with China in the WTO, including the issue of what's a developing country. I don't think Clete was just admitting that Brazil's still a developing country, but this is a big issue. And when you're negotiating an agreement with a country and they're saying up front that they consider themselves a developing country and therefore they may not live up to all of the obligations or think they need to, that makes those kind of negotiations pretty difficult.
No. Well, I would totally agree with your point about, I think, my limited experience in negotiating with China as well was that the only thing you ever accomplish is what they wanted to do. And I think that's a cautionary note when we think about what's going to happen in potential phase 2 negotiations. But to this point, in terms of China's perspective, we have this conversation that's been going on, but what do we think? And China's been reacting to that, but what do we think China's own agenda is, both vis-a-vis the United States, but also regionally? Is it all Belt and Road? Is it RCEP, the new agreement? What's sort of their affirmative agenda, and how do we see that sort of impacting the United States? And I just open that up to everyone on the panel to comment on. Kurt, maybe
I can jump into I think China would like, as Anne was saying, more voice, more room regionally, and greater expression of China's national power on the global stage, which is natural and inevitable. I think what the rest of the status quo powers, including the United States and as well as China's neighbors, would like China to do that in a way which resembles more what other strong countries have done in recent decades. China tends to look back to what rising powers did in the 19th century or the first half of the 20th century for models of success, and that then translates into intense friction with both its neighbors and the global system. Because there's just a lot of free riding, freeloading, and selective rules adoption, enforcement, and then somewhat aggressive rules shaping in the international sphere. So, for example, Belt and Road, you mentioned. China giving a lot of, or not giving, but lending a lot of money to the developing world for infrastructure, probably a good thing, and perhaps inevitable given the foreign reserve levels. How it's done, of course, has been very problematic in terms of both the transparency, the sensitivity to environmental and social concerns in the recipient countries, who owns the infrastructure once it's built, how it's implemented, where the labor comes from, all of that, and the rejection of best practices as adopted by other nations over the last 50, 60, 70 years is noticeable and is going to cause failures, like a lot of the Belt and Road projects ending up being failures. So I would expect this trend of China trying to see the global playpen as an extension of how China works to continue, but then over time, the soft edges or the hard edges to get sanded off. But I expect that to take a long time because it's such a big country.
It's a little bit of a clash of systems. Clete, looks like you want
Yeah, no, I want to speak to sort of China's agenda with respect to international institutions, because I think both Wendy and Kurt made good points here that I wanted to pick up on. And I think, Wendy, I appreciate you raising the issue of developing country status, because I think if you look at China and China looks at the international trade system, it's largely benefited from its WTO membership. It hasn't felt constrained by the rules. There aren't rules on a lot of its, what we see as unfair trade practices, whether it's the subsidies, whether it's the forced technology transfer. And then it's treated in a way that is more favorable than the United States. And China is treated as a developing country, and therefore, in these negotiations, it asserts that it doesn't have to take on the same level of obligation as the United States. And that's fundamentally unfair, and it needs to change. And I do think that if China wants to truly be seen as an equal on the global stage, it needs to take on obligations commensurate with its status. So I don't think China can continue to have it both ways, where it benefits from this system and then claims to be the defender of the system. If it truly wants to be seen as an equal, it needs to step up and say, we're not going to ask for preferential treatment anymore. And I'm glad Kurt brought up the Belt and Road, because I'd apply the same logic to the World Bank. How is China one of the largest recipients of World Bank funds while it's going around the world funding similar projects through Belt and Road? It doesn't make any sense. And I think what China needs to do is say, look, I'm either going to step up and ask for equal treatment, or I'm not going to expect it. And I think that's the choice that they have to make.
Yeah. All right. I want to. We're going to a little bit have to be conscious of time here, and I want us to really maybe drill down just a little bit and get more concrete. And Wendy, I want to turn to you to sort of, as someone who's, as you mentioned, negotiated a lot of agreements, sort of, how do you see this kind of playing out over the next year? And when you look at sort of the institutional factors, we've talked about that, right? WTO, what that means. But also maybe widen the aperture to sort of, what some of the implications are for, the other large economies in the area, Japan, Korea, Taiwan. We've talked about them in the geopolitical context. Issues of sort of the little bit more granular perspective on, how companies and governments might be seen over the next couple of years.
Okay. So first, with respect to implementation over the coming year, clearly with the coronavirus, implementation of the Phase 1 agreement is going to be put on the back seat. And I think the best thing the United States can do at this point is be compassionate and recognize this and accept it, and not make abrasive comments publicly on what we expect. This is a pretty serious pandemic going around. I don't think anyone in this room understands the seriousness or how long this is going to last. But when you look at the impact on what's going on with respect to consumption, people are staying home, they're not buying stuff. Production, people have been asked to stay home, not go to work, and the list goes on and on, what this means for supply chains. So I think we need to accept that implementation is going to take a backseat, and I think we should be compassionate about that. Now, that doesn't mean China gets off the hook. It just means that when we interact and consult with China, we recognize what they're going through now, and we figure out jointly how we can, keep this agreement going forward. I think there is a heavy incentive on both sides for this agreement to work. I don't think either side wants to get back to that tariff tit for tat. And I think China will do what it can do to implement this deal the best it can, particularly given the current circumstances. And I think for the U.S., I don't think it's hard for me to believe that the United States is going to admit there are all these violations of the agreement. I think that will just lead people to think that this agreement's no better than any of the previous agreements that were negotiated. So I think there will be a strong incentive for both sides to implement the deal and not to get back to imposing tariffs. When the rest of the world looks at this, again, I think there's kind of a sigh of relief if this is the trajectory we're on for the next year. But I would also just say I think each country has their own agenda vis-a-vis China for the coming year. Kurt mentioned the planned state visit of Xi Jinping to Japan this spring, and I think Japan's very focused on what they can do, particularly on the business side with China right now. The virus, again, who knows if this visit will take place on schedule, but that's another question. The EU, the EU is very focused on trying to conclude their own bilateral investment treaty. I forget the formal name of that, but they're going to have a big high-level meeting in September, and they're focusing on that. So I think it's important to keep in mind that as we're all consumed with us and what the phase 1 deal means and when phase 2 is going to begin and how is that going to play out, other countries are figuring out their own agenda with China going forward and moving in that direction.
So I think we're going to get to questions in a few minutes here, but I want to pose one last question to the panel. We can take this idea of being a little bit more practical even to another layer, which is, so if you're a company representative representing a multinational, how should they be assessing the risks, whether they're political risks, economic risks of, operating in China now, kind of given, issues of the virus, issues of the U.S.-China relationship, the competing agendas. How should people be sort of thinking about that, and what sort of advice can you as professionals offer up?
I would say there's both risk and opportunity. It's a cliche, of course, but when things are fluid, and I would expect Chinese politics, particularly after the coronavirus, to be relatively fluid, that there is opportunity there, and as China figures out how to deal with what is certain to be a certain degree of technological decoupling, there is a lot of risk for U.S. technology companies, but there may be some opportunities hidden in the woodwork there, and so I think it's not a time for U.S. companies to pull back and say, "Wait, China's just too hard." Please don't. Any of you with big companies, don't let your boards just neglect China and pull back, because I think that would be the wrong thing to do. It's too important a market, and there will be opportunities that arise. Let me just say on the coronavirus, I had the misfortune of being like Mr. Spock, the science officer at the embassy in Beijing in 2003, and what's clear is that the economic impact, of just endorse what Wendy said, the economic impact of this is going to be larger than SARS, and China is 3-4 times bigger than it was
on China
in 2000.
and us,
and so people should be taking a close look at short-term mitigation strategies in terms of supply chain integrity and the like, but then looking how do the chips fall in 2021, both U.S. politics, China's reaction to the virus, the trade agreement. There's a lot of pieces moving.
Wendy?
Yeah, just I can be really brief. For me, it's all about diversification. And when we look back at this era, I think that's going to be the buzzword that we will apply to it, not only for companies, but for countries. And I think that, you know, in terms of the trade policy that's been followed by this administration has woken up many of our trade partners that maybe they're too dependent on us. I think the bilateral friction with China has led countries to think maybe they're too dependent not only on the US, but China as well. And then when you put on top of this a pandemic where if you've got all your eggs in a basket in your supply chain in one plant in Wuhan, then again, it's about diversification. I look back, and the Canadian Trade Minister's title a few years ago was rewritten to say the Minister of Trade and Diversification. I think that's maybe a title that will spread.
Nothing like being the northern neighbor. Anne?
I would say saying diversification is easier said than done because the companies that wanted to move out of China already did. They moved largely to Vietnam and some other places. But supply chains, especially for electronics, is a very difficult thing to replicate, especially in the short term. And many companies wanted to, but found that they couldn't because there wasn't enough labor in these other countries. There just wasn't enough to put together supply chain to replace what they already had in China. There were not enough ports. I mean, there's so many other issues. And so, again, unless people were there on the ground and can see the realities of it, it's just not a very realistic strategy to suddenly up and diversify. I think, yes, over time it's possible, but in the long term, anything is possible. And in regards to, working with China, I think that this pandemic, yes, we don't know the long-term effects, but it seems like early reports that antiviral cocktails seem to be effective in controlling the spread of the disease. It's very possible that China gets over this by the late spring and will use a lot of their monetary easing to try to really jumpstart the economy to make up for the losses in the first quarter. And so that could be a huge opportunity for American companies, given that there will be a flood of liquidity that's going to go into the Chinese economy.
Clete?
So I generally agree with a lot of what was said, and I think the theme that everyone should take away from our China policy is, again, it's here to stay. So managing that risk, there's going to be risk, that's going to be critical, looking for opportunities. I think diversification makes sense. The other thing I'll add to the mix, though, that I think is critical is making your voices heard and explaining to policymakers in Congress and in the administration and in other countries what is going on, how does it affect you, how does it affect your supply chains, what are the smart ways to deal with these problems, and what are the ways that have unintended consequences. Because I can tell you, when I was in the administration, I was one of those folks, there's a lot like me, who are very concerned about this China issue. They want to do something about it. And you don't always know what the impact of your policies are going to be. So please make your voices heard so the people who are doing the right thing are more equipped to do it. And I think that's really, really important. On coronavirus, again, I will start with a huge caveat that I don't think any of us know exactly how this is going to play out. And I am not medically equipped to even opine on it. But I will give just a slight contradictory view, and it's this. When we were negotiating with China, one of the major factors in their willingness to basically do what the U.S. was asking was the state of their economy. And you could literally look at the graph of when things were going well and when things were going poorly, and it directly correlated to how much progress we were making at the negotiating table. And so what that tells me is if this does have as big an impact in China's economy as we think it's going to have, or it may have, China is going to be in a position where it is really going to need to try to do things to the U.S. because it's not going to want to upset the U.S. And I do think that gives a better chance for implementation maybe than others are letting on. And again, I will acknowledge we don't know for sure, but I think that, again, that experience as a negotiator I think is at least useful to how some of the Chinese thinking could work as well.
All right. Well, good. Well, I think we'll conclude on that point. We'll maybe have some time for some Q&A.
Maybe
Ken?
take a couple quick questions
Yep.
from the room. Hi, thank you very much for your insights. I'm Brandon Hughes with FAO Global, and our company does strategic advisory and helping set up operations abroad. And we actually have people on the ground, at the granular level, feeding us insight into what's happening in different areas and how the virus is affecting and how trade implementation is affecting the companies. And one of the things that we see is that there's still a lot of interest, both in the U.S. and other areas, to go to China, and companies are very receptive for this. However, it's obviously becoming more difficult given the political tensions and, fighting with the news every day, with our, advising our clients. But my question is, and this is more to Professor Lee, if there is a flood of liquidity and there are financial measures in the next quarter or Q3, assuming the coronavirus is contained, and what industries do you see as being the main benefactors or areas for any sort of an easing, if you will? Because we're very curious about that, and we'd like to know your opinion and any insight from the panel as well. Thank you.
Well, I would fully expect that to go into all the sectors that were hit hardest, clearly the retail sectors, maybe the transportation sectors. But China also has very long-term goals, and that specifically is around green and technology, a clean environment. I know for a fact, because various provincial governors have spoken to me, they all have a mandate to try to bring in innovation to their provinces because they have an environmental issue they need to deal with, because they want to contribute what they can to slow down climate change. And so I know that there's definitely going to be a lot of money and investment that will go into clean technology. And so they're going to want to entice foreign companies that have that kind of technology to come to China too. And so I think those are going to be some of the low-hanging fruit that I can see. I'm sure that the liquidity is going to pretty much go to all the industries, but in terms of where I think the areas that they want to emphasize would probably be in those areas.
And I would just anticipate a bailout program or a lot of financing going to small-scale services companies, which exist on a fairly thin razor's edge already, and that can be distributed quickly and provide stimulus in ways that, let's say, infrastructure spending, the lag time is much greater.
Yeah, so a combination of fiscal and monetary easing then. So another question?
Hi, Ron Lorenzen with Kelly Dry and Warren. I'd like to pick up on this point before about efforts to multilateralize some of the gains made in the bilateral talks. With China, at least if we look at the trilateral initiative, the challenge is often what the party is doing as opposed to what official government action is occurring. Sometimes there's overlap, but a lot of times it's the party's role that has an important impact in terms of preference and in terms of support. So is there a need to consider what I'd loosely refer to as managed trade solutions in some of these areas where it's going to be difficult, if not impossible, to get China to change its economic model, as the Director General suggested earlier today? And then secondly, what sort of concessions should the U.S. be considering in order to get a enforceable agreement on some of these issues?
Who'd like to step up on that one? Clete, why don't you make a
thanks,
step,
Doug.
and Wendy, like you might have something to add.
Wendy, you ladies first? No, I'm joking. No, it's a good question, and I think certainly we have to be realistic on the limitations of what is going to happen in China's economy over the short term. And there was a lot of criticism of certain aspects of the Phase 1 deal, saying, oh, you didn't fix the state-owned enterprise problem, or you didn't fix, that was never realistic in the first place. And I think the same applies to the WTO. I think in the short term, expecting China to suddenly become a market economy is unrealistic. But we can put in place disciplines that I think create that level playing field that I was talking about. And I think provisions on state-owned enterprises and on subsidies, difficult, but something that you could try to do. And again, we may have to be somewhat incremental here, but we just simply cannot have this situation where we completely leave China out of that system. Managed trade, obviously it's not the ideal solution. I think a rule set is what you would want to see, but we're going to have to be pragmatic.
So maybe I can just add on managed trade, given that I negotiated a lot of managed trade agreements too, mainly with Japan. And when I look back on those days or some of the pressures facing negotiators this time around, I understand it's very frustrating. You keep working on rules, and then you expect the rules to produce these outcomes in the market. And somehow, it doesn't follow that smoothly, and then you go back to the table and try and improve the rules. So I understand the pressure to take a more managed trade approach. However, on balance, what really concerns me is the purchasing targets just seem to be really a poke in the eye to a lot of China's other trading partners, which I think is going to hurt us as we try and multilateralize an approach towards China. It's very short term. And if you look at the agreement, it talks about purchases for the next 2 years. And then there's some kind of what I would call a vague sentence about what might happen after the 2 years, that both sides project that this trajectory should continue. So those 2 years end, you sell all this stuff, and maybe there's a lot of resentment in China, and maybe a lot of stuff in the warehouses on fields. And then, you're kind of back where you were, and you need to, again, you're faced with these structural issues, and you need to address them.
Can I just make one thing explicit, which we've all been saying, but it's been implicit rather than explicit, which is that plurilateral approaches to the China problem, some of them are with China, and some of them are around China. And that around China aspect, I think, would be a particularly good investment, given the way that we've characterized the landscape for the next 2 years. For example, taking the U.S.-Japan Digital Services Agreement, plurilateralizing that, et cetera. Those kind of approaches could be particularly powerful right now.
TPP?
Yeah, there you go.
I wanted to say quickly on Wendy's. Oh, sorry. On Wendy's point, I was going to say the structural issues are what I focused on, especially with ag, and that if those actually get implemented, those numbers should be numbers that
That was the
continue to
best
grow.
part of the agreement.
And that's my point, is that actually, I think you can't make that same argument on agriculture as you maybe could make on some of the manufacturing stuff.
All right. So I think we can you like?
We're going to have to wrap up there. I know there was an endless amount of conversation we could have had here, and Doug was lobbying me for more time for this panel, but I'm sorry when we added Director Azevedo to the schedule, we had to consolidate things a bit. There was so much to talk about. This panel was everything we'd hoped for. Thank you all to our speakers so much. We're going to have a very quick turnover to the next panel, so please don't go too far. Thanks to our panel again.